Today we will be talking about Eunice Foote and her experiments on carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere compared to John Tyndall's experiments on the same topic. These led to modern climate sciences.
We will also explain why Tyndall was awarded credit for the discovery, even though Foote's experiment was performed first. These topics tie into the scientific aspects of instrumentation and the socio-political dimensions of experimentation.
Who is Eunice Foote? Eunice Foote is the first person to discover that increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can cause an increase in global temperatures, publishing a paper called Circumstances Affecting the Sun's Rays. Her overlooked work came into public light when a petroleum geologist published a paper after realizing her discovery came 3 years earlier than Tyndall's.
She was an American scientist from Seneca Falls, New York, and attended Troy Female Seminary, where one of her teachers believed that both women and men should have access to scientific education. The seminary also had the first chemistry lab constructed solely for student use.
Who is John Tyndall? John Tyndall is typically credited with being the first person to discover a connection between carbon dioxide and atmospheric temperature. John Tyndall was an Irish physicist who researched in a multitude of fields throughout his life.
He was educated at the National School in Carlow until he was 19 and then settled at the University of Marburg, where he wrote a mathematical dissertation. He entered the Royal Society in 1852, where he studied physics, but he eventually branched into other disciplines, such as the scattering of light particles and spontaneous generation.
In Foote's experiment, the only instruments used were glass cylinders, thermometers, and an air pump to get the gases into the cylinders.
She isolated component gases from the atmosphere and subjected them to the sun's rays. She measured their temperatures and discovered that the carbon dioxide absorbed enough heat so that it could affect climate, saying, "An atmosphere of carbon dioxide would give to our Earth a high temperature, and, if some suppose, at one period of its history the air had been mixed with a larger proportion than at present, an increased temperature must have necessarily resulted."
In Tyndall's experiment, he used this instrument to accomplish the same goal as Foote's glass jars, to detect the absorption of heat by gases in the atmosphere.
As you can see, this apparatus has many different working components, with a Leslie cube as the heat source as opposed to the sun. This apparatus also includes a differential spectrometer, which Tyndall invented, allowing the absorption of heat to be measured with relatively small error.
Foote and Tyndall's use of instrumentation directly correlated to their socio-political factors. Foote only used glass jars, an air pump, and thermometers. She was a female scientist, meaning that she was less respected in the community. She was not associated with a university or institution, so she had limited access to instruments. She lived in America, where there was less scientific development. Her paper was presented by a male colleague instead of her in the American Association for the Advancement of Science's annual meeting in 1856, and her paper was passed over for publication.
In comparison, Tyndall had an advanced apparatus which was much more sensitive and accurate than Foote's glass jars. He was a professor at the Royal Institution of Great Britain, which meant that he had access to specialists who could make instruments for his specific needs. He also had the money and funding through the Royal Society to use the best instrumentation available to scientists. He was a veteran of apparatus creation and experimental design, with over 180 published experimental papers at the time of his death. Why didn't Tyndall know of Foote's research?
Well, Foote's paper was only published in one journal, which was American, and she didn't have any connections overseas. Along with this, she was barely recognized in America, let alone globally, so it is very unlikely that Tyndall would have heard of her experiment or paper.
Overall, the socio-political dimensions of science are complex, and they affect a multitude of aspects in regards to experimentation.